Good evening. Yes, we happen to have this bust of Brahms here. It's not like I don't like the other composers, it's just we happen to have this. So whenever we talk about Brahms, there he is. I'm going to begin by playing a little bit of recorded music for you. That's unusual, but here it goes. Okay, this is music by, you might have guessed, Johann Strauss Jr., number 2. It's a waltz dedicated to Johannes Brahms. They were very close friends, and there's a famous picture of Brahms and Johann Strauss II standing on a balcony. Strauss was younger and looking dapper and very excited to be standing next to Brahms. And Brahms, believe it or not, was actually more excited than Strauss because he was just enamored of Strauss's music. Brahms had this strange quality, which was that he really outspokenly admired, more than any other composers, the simplest and the more natural, he felt composers who just oozed melody. He was always complimenting them. And in fact, when Richard Strauss, who was one of the young upstarts in Brahms's life, when his music was first being performed, Brahms came and said to him, you know, you should step back and just try to write an 8-bar phrase like Johann Strauss Jr. And that is part of the theme of today's talk, because Brahms's music, more and more as he deepened his thoughts about the past and his own music, became rhythmically very complex. And that is a big part of what today's talk is about. I'm going to ask the quartet to start by playing something that is almost the opening of the third movement. Some of you are laughing because, you know, I have to confess, I don't like in the current climate to just outright lie. So instead, I let you know what you're about to hear isn't exactly the truth. Okay, this is the opening of the third movement with a slight alteration. Okay, what that actually is I took what Brahms really wrote, which you'll hear in a moment, and I normalized it, another terrible thing to do. Whenever you normalize something strange, it's bad for you. But in this case, Brahms's music is often strange in a beautiful way. In fact, Walter Pater always said that beauty is defined by an aspect of strangeness, and that I removed the strangeness, not all of it. The harmonies are by Brahms, and the tune is almost by Brahms, but what I did was to do what he advised the young Richard Strauss. I simplified it into 2 8-bar phrases that are what is known in musical terminology as an antecedent and a consequent. An opening phrase that ends on the dominant that then responds in a very simple parallel structure and ends on the tonic. Brahms did not actually do that. Let's hear the opening of that movement the way Brahms actually wrote it. great. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's much longer. It's 24 bars, but beyond that, it has a rhythmic life that's very complex, which gets more complex as it goes on. You know, there's a famous story, which is true, that Brahms was sitting with Mrs. Strauss, and that's Johann Strauss II, and she asked for his autograph. And in those days, actually, composers sometimes still do this if they don't have their iPad on their computer and their phone. If they have a pen, then they would write a little bit of music of theirs and then sign their name. So what Brahms did in this well-known story is he wrote the Blue Danube, a phrase from the Blue Danube, and wrote, "Not, alas, by Johannes Brahms." So what you just heard is full of complexity. For one thing, can we hear this with this? I know you didn't practice it this way, but can we hear this without the viola solo? That's going to be a little bit complicated. Okay, now before you go on, right away, you might think that's and 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, right? Do it again. 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, and 1. Okay, but actually it's not. It's not. Is it? No. No.
I don't think so.
Okay. I'm warming them up. We haven't worked together yet. Okay, so actually the viola starts on an upbeat. Now let's hear it with the viola, and you'll see that Brahms, right from the beginning, is giving you a metric displacement. Don't worry, it doesn't hurt. You don't need a chiropractor. A metric displacement. Try. Okay. So this is already incredibly complex, and I'm sure both Mrs. Strauss and Johann Strauss Jr. had a lot of trouble with that. Try dancing to that. Don't. Never mind. But anyway, the viola is basically a fairly clear 3/4. 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, and 3, 1. But their rhythm, bum, ba-dum, bum. You can tell where it starts because of the viola, but it still sounds. You hear two things at once. Now, this kind of metric displacement, and now by metric displacement, I mean meter. Metric is meter. I'm not talking about the metric system. You know, in music, you've got two basic words for rhythm, and many others. The most basic is meter, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, but the rhythm that happens over that is just called rhythm. We don't have a good word for it. But, so in other words, the music, ba-dee-bum, ba-dee-bum, is the rhythm, and so is dee-ba-bum, beam, and anything that happens over the meter is the rhythm of the phrase. So the meter is already displaced. So that goes on for a little while, and actually, while we're at it, there's also something Brahms is doing harmonically that's just, it's a wonderful little game he's playing. It starts in F major, D minor, but we don't get a C sharp because this is going to be a little complicated at first. We don't get a C sharp because the phrase ends in F major. And then we get a C sharp. And then eventually the C natural comes back and we get a D flat. Now this is all I need to tell you about this. The C sharp, not that one, the C sharp keeps leading towards D minor, and the D flat keeps pulling towards F. And in the midst of all this meter, he's also playing this little back and forth. Is it a C sharp? Is it a D flat? It's kind of easy to tell, but he keeps shifting. So that shift is like a displacement also. We have the displacement of ba-dee-bum and the rhythm of the viola against it, and we have this key shift that's hinged on a pun. A D flat and a C sharp are the same note. Now, there's also something at bar 7. Let's hear without the viola, just bar 7 and 8. Okay, what was that rhythm? Ba-da, ba-da, ba-dum. Try that again. Now, if you forget the piece that you've been listening to, play it one more time so it sounds like, you know. Yeah, okay, that That suddenly is in 2/8, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, right? It just is spliced in there. And the closest thing to that kind of splicing into there is Stravinsky, and we'll get to that in a minute. Brahms did not copy anything from Stravinsky. Don't quote me about that. Okay, but the rhythmic complexity that we have here is already at a very high level, and it can go floating right by you. That's the thing. That's why I want to draw your attention to it. Play that phrase one more time, and then we'll stick the viola in there. Right. Okay, now let's start with the viola right on that bar and go for a few bars. Okay, so talk about, that almost sounds like you're displaced, and at that moment you're sort of really not sure. You can almost stumble because it's so off. So far we have an accompaniment that feels like it's moved over the bar line. And we have a melody that is clearly on the beat, but you don't know that right away. And you also have suddenly a divided up little context. Now, before we hear a lot more of this movement, where did this idea come from? Now, Schumann did a little bit of this, and of course he was mentored by Schumann, but not the same way, not quite the way that Brahms developed it more and more and more. With Brahms, he got inspired by Renaissance choral music. Now, how did he come across that? You know, we have musicology now. On the computer you can find every score, a recording of it, and anything you want. And there has been an established kind of musicology for a long time. In Brahms's day, the idea of musicology, of studying the past, of understanding scores, of analyzing how they fit together and giving a sense of the arc of history, that was new. And he was friends with a lot of the top musicologists of that time. And he himself, in a way, was a musicologist. Now, he fell into it by conducting choruses. And that's where he wanted to do pieces. He had put together a women's chorus, small one, for a wedding. They wanted to continue, so it grew from about 8 singers to 40. So we had 40 women in this chorus. And there wasn't a lot of music that anyone knew for them to perform, so he would do research. And he found lots of interesting Renaissance music that could be done for various numbers of voices, and it could be arranged. So he fell into that. Now, let me play you a little bit of Renaissance music, two pieces that he actually did conduct with his women's chorus, although they're not sung exclusively by women here. Here is one by Heinrich Isaac. It's famous, called Innsbruck, the opening. Okay. That was notated when Brahms got the score. It was notated in 4. So the melody that you just heard, it's in a different key here, is in 4 like this. But Brahms realized it could also be in 3, like this. It's going to be the same notes, same everything, except the accents. And in fact, when you're listening to it, it floats. It just floats. And it floats because there's a tendency to do this music without accents and just use the words. And the words fall into patterns of 3 and 4, which is what Brahms was fascinated by. Here's another example of that. Also something Brahms conducted. Now, that tune, which is by Scandello, an Italian who lived in Dresden, that's all I know about him, but it's enough. It's from Schein uns du liebe Sonne, and it starts, again, the copy Brahms had was notated in 4. And he notated it by putting accent marks in red on top in 3. He did that with the other one, too. In other words, the reason we know that he was paying attention to the idea that you could hear it in 3 is that he took his manuscripts that were in 4 and he wrote on top of them in red ink, a red pencil. So here it is in 3, the way Brahms would have marked it, or did mark it. Actually, it changes from 3 to 2 and back to 3. I'll count this for you. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, and then it goes on like that. So if you've been in a chorus that does Renaissance music, the phrasing and all of it's actually quite tricky because of that, and it can get much more complicated. So Brahms was very involved in conducting this music, cataloging it, editing it, and that sounds like the caterpillar from Alice in Wonderland. Okay, and it influenced his music in a profound way. So even a simple waltz, and he had to write simple waltzes too. Why did he have to do that? I'll tell you why. Because he was a practical musician trying to make a living, and the biggest audience were people in their homes who had pianos, which was practically everyone he knew. So they didn't have phonographs. Do you know what a phonograph is? Typewriter? Typewriter? Yeah? Okay. Okay. They didn't have phonographs, they didn't have CD players, they didn't have audio files, but they also, everyone played the piano, more or less, and even if they didn't, they had one because somebody they knew would come play. They didn't always play that well, so Brahms was in the habit of arranging or having someone arrange for him everything, symphonies, the Requiem, for piano 4 hands, sometimes 2 pianos. They could do it with 2 pianos in the home of the Wittgensteins. They had a really big room with 2 pianos in it. And you know that Joachim, the violinist who worked with Brahms, was a cousin of one of the Wittgensteins by marriage? Well, now you know. Wow, I really got you. Okay, so here's a little waltz by Brahms that he wrote for piano in the home. You might recognize it, it's quite famous. But even in this tiny little waltz, he does a couple of interesting things. So first of all, like the viola solo, the upbeat is very strong and the downbeat is weak. So that already is a slight displacement. Even if you don't accent it, it's because it's falling down all the time. It's the higher note. If he, let's say he had, or if he had connected it, then we would know where we were, right? But he purposely leaves rests and drops it. So it does have a slight accent on the end. Then you might have noticed this. There's the one that goes 3-1, 3-1, and there's one that imitates it going 1-2, 1-2. Maybe they're arguing. You could probably play it that way, I don't know. Oh, I don't know, that's a little too much. Now, other people were writing waltzes and imitating, a lot of people were imitating Brahms. In fact, I have a few on my iPad. You notice this whole quartet is using iPads? So, and I'm using it a little bit too. This is getting to be another world. It already is. Okay, so here are a couple of things that are very interesting. Brahms wasn't the only one to experiment with rhythm, but he is the only one who did what he did with layers and displacement. By displacement, I mean the metric displacement. You feel that the rhythm has moved away from the bar line. Those Renaissance pieces did not have bar lines, so they couldn't be working against them because they didn't have any. In fact, that's an important point, is that what we think of as typical rhythm, the Brahms did the 8-bar phrase, the typical structure, those things didn't always exist. They had to evolve. So from the Middle Ages, let's say starting with chant, where the only rhythm was the rhythm of speech, and then dance forms, and eventually instrumental music. It took a long time before dance forms merged into a kind of instrumental structural thing where you had patterns that were expected and typical and so-called normal. But Brahms was interested in the music before that, and he was one of the few composers interested. But other people experimented. For example, Ferdinand Hiller, who was a wonderful composer, mostly forgotten, a little older than Brahms, wrote some beautiful music, a lot of beautiful music actually, and he experimented with this. Now, I won't tell you what the experiment is. See if you can hear something that, it's not at all strange sounding, so you have to try to pick up on something that would have been weird in the early 19th century. Sorry, the iPad went dark. That's not supposed to happen. Okay, we'll do it again. So it sounds very normal, but it's in 5. I remember on NPR a few years ago that there was a program about 5/4, and they talked about take 5 and all these things and how unusual it was, and Tchaikovsky's famous, I'll play that for you later, his supposed waltz in 5. But actually 5 was experimented with a long time before that, and this is not even an original concept with Hiller, but it is in 5. So listen to it with that in mind. Perfectly well to be in 5. In fact, while we're on the subject, there was a thing called the waltz in 5 in the early 19th century. It's called the waltz 5-step. How did I find that? I have to tell you, it was strange. I was looking at the Tchaikovsky waltz in 5, which maybe I'll quickly play for you here. How quickly can I do this? Here we go. One, two, three, four, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. And I was wondering if Tchaikovsky did that, is it likely that he was the first? Not really. And then Hiller, which is way before Tchaikovsky, way before. So I started to look around, and I didn't find it on a music site. I found it on a dance history site called Capering and Kickery. Capering and Kickery, don't forget that. And they had instructions on how to dance a waltz in 5. And I found a waltz in 5 written by somebody extremely bad, let alone small print. His name was Adolphe. That's his second name. Etc. So it's in 5, but it sounds like a waltz because he keeps giving you a waltz. And apparently what you do, if you want to try this, is you waltz and then you do these turns on the 5. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No, okay. All right, now let's get back to the Brahms that we have right here. Let's go on then to, let's start at the beginning and go all the way to what you did, and let's bear in mind that this time, aside from the rhythm, what happens is this big second phrase, the second 12 bars, the tune passes from the viola to the first violin, but the first violin has a rest at the beginning of every measure. Do you want to play right when you come in with everybody for me, just to hear the rests? Okay, so the tune, instead of being what it was before, 1, 2, and 3 is now 1, ba, ba, bum. So now we have the tune moved over to agree with the accompaniment. So the whole thing is now off, but the viola stabilizes the ensemble by playing, running eighth notes all the way through. So let's start at the beginning and go. Let's go further, and I'll give you a foreshadowing of what happens. Then we get into a section where I'll start doing this, where it actually feels like it's in 2 instead of 3. So you shouldn't be surprised anymore. All over this piece, it goes in 3 with displaced feelings that are over the bar, that sometimes are very confusing, even in 2/8 time. And then at one point, it just goes into what feels like 2, and then back to 3. All right? I'll conduct, but don't look at me. Okay, perfect spot to stop. Beautiful, beautiful. Now, even though the rhythm is now emerging as one of the main aspects of this, there are a couple of beautiful harmonic things. And as you know, Brahms was surrounded by harmonic innovators, and he usually didn't really like what they did that much. I mean, he had a mixed love-hate relationship with Wagner, of course, which then became politicized, and that's another story, completely separate from the music. And then he was eventually, when Strauss and Mahler came along, Richard Strauss and Mahler, he was unhappy with a lot of their harmonic innovations. He was harmonically, he thought of himself as a conservative, continuing, by conservative I don't mean political, but that he was continuing a tradition that they were ruining. At the same time, as he was extremely progressive harmonically in ways that even he may not have totally been conscious of. But what he was conscious of, that's always a safe thing to say, who knows, you can't possibly know what he was conscious of. But anyway, when he did interesting harmonic things, there was always an explanation in a very straightforward way that allowed him to do these remarkably strange things. So for example, here, sorry. It wouldn't be strange for Wagner to do that, or these are slightly odd harmonies for Brahms, and they're all in block harmonies. There's nothing, there's no dissonance tying it together. What it is, though, each thing is a summary of what we've heard in terms of the dominants or the tonics. In other words, just to remind the three of you who are not professional musicians, that if you're in a key like F, that's the tonic, and the dominant is the 5 up. So here we have, that's 5 of F, and this, which he goes to immediately, is 5 of D, and those are the two keys he's been playing with, F major and D minor. But by putting those two dominants next to each other, we get this strange feeling of a different interval. It's a little odd, but it's related to the two keys he's in. And then it's the same thing later when he's in G, and then E, and again, it's the same relationship, but G is the dominant of C, which was the dominant of F. So he's moving higher and higher away from the key. And then the other one, E, is 5 up from A, which was 5 up from D. So what he's doing is actually very traditional. He's transposing up by a fifth, which is very standard, but he's doing it by splicing out all the possible connective tissue. So in a way, this is also displaced, like the rhythm, because he's removed the things that connect it and make it stable. He's just put them right next to each other. And that feeling that Brahms creates rhythmically, oh, wow, rhythmically and harmonically of splicing and reorganizing, of displacing something, is very, very cinematic and eventually becomes very modern. Now, let's go to the very next section, where I'll tell you right away, in the first violin we have this. Why don't you play that by yourself, and let's think about the time signature. Yeah, now it's a little confusing because, in terms of the beat, especially if you're just listening without looking at the page, because of the repeated C here, the fact that it keeps coming back gives you this pulse of 2, tempo, timpa, bim, bum, bim, bum, bim, but actually it's in 3, and it's a large 3. Let's play everybody there with the pickup. Okay, now we should do our excerpts from the whole piece. I'm going to give you a quick overview of some of the rest of the piece so you can see some extremely interesting rhythmic things from other movements before we come back. So from the first movement, this is right at the beginning of the piece, you have the most straightforward kinds of Brahmsian rhythmic displacements, which is the difference between 3s and 2s. 1, 2, 3, and 1. Brahms 3 against 2 is very common, but also the feeling of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, which is very Latin, but with Brahms it's not Latin. Here we are. Yeah, so it's pretty clear that if you were trying to dance to that, you'd have to work it out and get Paul Taylor, because you really can't just suddenly dance to it. Let me conduct that as you do it again for the audience. I mean, of course, first of all, you're not in an orchestra, but even if we were, you wouldn't look at the conductor, so don't do it. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. Okay, so you saw how that went between. That's a simple example of very Brahmsian kind of rhythmic displacements. Now let's go to a section in the middle, which is much more complicated. Let's just hear it first. Same movement, first movement. There are some things in there that are totally amazing for the time and rhythmically, and you probably, if you haven't heard it before, you were astonished. Were you astonished? Okay. Let's just hear. The first thing is 4 against 3, which is a little bit more complicated. And, I mean, 2 against 3 is 1, 2, and 3. It's very easy. And then you switch it like this. This is what you should do. It keeps you living longer. It's 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, and 3. But 4 against 3, bop, 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 which happens when they're playing it. It's incredible what happens. Let's start right at the beginning of that excerpt. And when the viola comes in 3, notice that the first violin is still in 4. Then, the second violin comes in 3. The viola comes in 4. Then they all emerge into 3s. And then something unbelievable happens, which we'll get to. Okay, good. Let's play that without the second violin and see how simple the music seems. Okay, now let's put the second violin with its 3s. Okay, and this is a metaphor for life. You can be the only one in 3 and convince everyone else to be in 3. One lone voice doesn't have to play second fiddle for long. Don't forget that. Okay. Now, then he puts rests in, and the rests are disorienting because they just come in and you think, okay, I'm still counting. Was I ever counting? I don't know where I am. Aren't those rests a pain? Are they harder than playing the music? They are? Oh, okay. All right. The rests are hard. And then it goes suddenly back into 2 in the lower strings, dum, dum, and you think, what is that, a polka, or is this Dvorak? What's going? And then the most amazing thing happens, which is the viola and cello are playing a 3 against 2, but they're only playing the 3s. Dum, bom, 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 bom. While the upper strings are going da, da, da. The upper strings are still in 4, and the lower strings are in a big, slow 3, not a fast 3. So let's just, is it possible to start? Of course it is. 3, 12, 13, 3, 14, and I'll just do that. Don't you stop. I'll do that when the amazing thing happens. And that rest, even Brahms thought, okay, I better have a rest here. I bet he looked at that for a long time. He sent it to Joachim, what do I do now? He said, I have no idea. He sent it to Robert Fuchs, who was teaching at the conservatory. He was a very, I'll play something of his for you in a minute, a very, very conservative composer who probably said, you shouldn't be doing this at all. And then he sent it to Elliot Carter, who said, I think I'm going to do that. Okay, now let's hear the same excerpt, but stopping right at that rest, where we stopped now, right after the big. Okay, now listen carefully to all of that. It's extraordinary. It's crazy, isn't it? Now, in the second movement, the second movement is very beautiful and very lyrical, and it does have a passage in 5/4 time. Now, we already know that Hiller already wrote something in 5/4 time way before this. Did Brahms know that? Probably. He was very good friends with Hiller, very good friends, and he probably looked at all his music, probably dismissed it in some brusque manner like he did everything, but he probably didn't forget the fives. But let's listen to how with Brahms, as usual in this quartet, the rests are extremely important because, yes, the first violin is playing in 5, but the ties over the bar and the rests, I mean ties over beats, and the rests make you feel like you're floating. There's not a real sense of pulse. Or maybe I should say there's a sense of pulse, but not of meter. Let's try that at the tranquillo. Yeah, it's a gorgeous excerpt. And the first violin you see is off by a 16th. It's just staggered. It's syncopated. And syncopation just means that a weak beat is held into the strong. Instead of going bom, 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 or dot, 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 you go dot, 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 dot. That's the simplest thing, syncopation. But the syncopation goes on for so long that there's a disorienting quality. There's a sense of restlessness and also imbalance. You almost can lose your balance trying to figure out where is the beat. Partly because since he's syncopated, but it's also the main line that you're listening to, your ear wants to go with that, and it's struggling because the accompaniment figures don't fit with it. But also what Brahms does is he links the unusual harmonies to the unusual rhythms, and the more standard harmonies to the more standard rhythms. This is a brilliant thing. It seems obvious, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, this is a great example. And what I mean by that, let's listen to bar 47 and 48. Now here, I'll give you this is in 5/4, and Brahms, that's why I use an iPad, because these things fly all over the place. Brahms, what we have, sorry, I can't see how small this is. That harmonically is already, I mean, just the scale where it seems exotic, but then this F flat becomes an E. So what he's doing is he's moving from a flat key to a sharp key. Everything's lifting without there being stable underpinnings of harmony. So you feel, just the way you feel rhythmically floating, you feel harmonically also floating, and as if there's no anchor. And then, in the next bar, which I'll do that, he arrives in 4/4, and the harmony has stabilized. Let's try that passage. See, on the iPad, I could have made it bigger and seen it. Okay, go ahead. Okay, I gave you kind of the upbeat instead of the downbeat. But you hear when it goes dee da 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 dee da, and suddenly it feels like it's in 4, that you also get a sense of key. And before that, he associates rhythmic, the displacement, the metric displacement, with a lack of focus on the harmony, which is, again, an extraordinary and brilliant kind of first thing to do. Very innovative is what I should say. So when we talk about Brahms being a conservative composer, we already know, I mean, it's really not true. And Schoenberg's famous article about Brahms the Progressive is mostly about harmony and form, a little bit about rhythm. But the rhythm is really probably the most innovative thing that Brahms did, along with something that I want to stress, which is the fact that his new idea about rhythm came from the study of past music. That is the thing. He didn't just have a new idea about rhythm out of nowhere. I mean, for example, Chopin had some new ideas about rhythm, but they were all in the right hand. Nothing in the left hand. So in the right hand, you had cascading 11s and 15s and 17s, all kinds of free-floating notes that nobody had quite done before, because he was taking it from the few people who had done it before, who were singers who can't count. Well, that's sort of true. He took it from opera. In opera, singers were always throwing lines around, you know, and doing embellishments, and the conductors were all going like this, you know, and like that. And so he took those lines, and that's why some pianists with their left hands are sort of like conductors, you know, now what do I do? But with Brahms, he didn't, it wasn't something in the air, and it wasn't improvisatory like with Chopin and in the salon. It was a scholarly discovery based on a serious study of music from another time, and he thought, you know, nobody's doing this. And it's so interesting to me. So he put this idea of pre-metered music, music that before the time that 3/4 and 4/4 and 6/8 were established as normal. He took music from that era and took those concepts and made it his rhythmic premise. Now, even more amazing is if you consider the early 20th century, after Verklärte Nacht and after Schoenberg's 12 tones, we're moving into neoclassicism, which was, of course, one of many isms that were at war with each other. But if you think of the Stravinsky class group, looking back to the past to find techniques that were not used anymore and to use those techniques, Brahms did that first. That's what I'm saying. So that Brahms actually foreshadowed a lot. And I'll tell you, here's something amazing. Listen to these exercises, and even if you are a professional pianist, you may never have heard these. Here are a couple of exercises. Okay, it's just scales and arpeggios and things in all of these exercises, but they are rhythmically really complicated. Here's another one. And one more. Okay, anyway, that sounded similar. Basically, these exercises are, which are by Brahms, they're piano exercises in rhythm. Now, the 51 exercises are not all in rhythm. They do many, many other things, but quite a few of them are, and especially number 1A and B and C and D and E and F, they're all rhythm, and they juxtapose 3 against 4 and 4 against 5 and 5 against 6 and 6 against 7 rhythmic patterns within a beat, 6 in one hand, 7 in the other, and shifting back and forth. This is not somebody, this is not normal. Now, the composer who said that Brahms's 51 exercises influenced his composing and made him write his piano concerto was Elliott Carter. So that's how far the influence goes. Now, many other great composers, of course, were influenced by this, but Carter, there's an interview which I just listened to the other day where he blamed Brahms. No, he talked about Brahms' rhythm being an influence on his. Now, what does that mean? Here's a little music by Elliott Carter, which is not as complex as some of his music at all, but it is, in every way, a neo-Baroque piece which is very indebted to this idea of layered rhythm. It's for flute, oboe, cello, and harpsichord, and it has layers of Baroque rhythmic dances on top of each other and interspliced in a way that is indebted to some of these Brahmsian concepts, even though other people had carried that torch. It doesn't necessarily come directly from Brahms. Now, I bet you that having heard the first movement of the Brahms makes that easier to listen to, doesn't it? If I should have started with that and then played it again next time. I know, too bad. And we can never go back. You can't unlearn the Brahms. Well, maybe you can. But that connection is very powerful. Now, Stravinsky took this very far, but especially with Stravinsky, there was a more and more Brahms-like, even though he would have denied this, but he denied everything unless he said it first. There was a very Brahms-like concentration on scholarship, taking things from the Renaissance and using, and also the Baroque period and even medieval music, and using them. This is a 54-second dance from his piece Agon, and in it there is a simple rhythm over and over in the castanets. It sounds exactly like that. The music on top of it is always placed in between and around it in a set of polyrhythms, meaning more multiple rhythms, until they align, and then it ends. So it's very mathematical, but actually he didn't think of it as mathematical. He thought of it more as Picasso, as cubist. So here you have a very cubist piece, and cubism is in some ways this intersecting planes, the destabilization of what you could call visual metrics. The visual metrics misalign, so they come out of music. It's usually, if you read any arts history, they always tell you that the arts did everything first and music followed. I'm not so sure about it. Here we go. That's the whole thing. Now, it's from a very big piece, but it does exactly what it set out to do. It's like a painting, in a way, because it's very still. Now, let's hear a little bit more of some moments from this Brahms. The theme itself, Brahms does something he does in many of his pieces, which is also a rather special thing, which is we're used to developing ideas. You take an idea, and it grows, and it flourishes and blossoms. But Brahms very often also deconstructs, which is also something that is very modern. He takes the tune apart until it's only got 3 notes, the first 3 notes. So perhaps you know where I'm headed. Let's start at basically where we were, pick up to B, but keep going all the way until, around C. Do you have a B and a C? Okay. Okay, great. I don't really have to explain that, but it also goes into 2. So maybe I will explain it. But basically, is held while some harmonies change. That's the tune. And then split between 2 instruments. Now that's important, because the viola does, and the first violin goes, so they're dividing it. That is something Brahms also got from medieval, which he only knew a little bit of, and some Renaissance music. It's called a hocket. A hocket, H-O-C, it's like pocket with an H. And it comes from, it's related to the word hiccup. And it has to do with dividing, in vocal music it was very common in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, where a tune would be divided among different singers, the same tune. It's come back. It's pretty common now, actually, and it's been back for a long time. But when Brahms did it, it was kind of strange. So you have, and then they go back and forth. The viola only has the A's, and the violin only has this. And then, of course, it begins to expand. Okay, I'm stopping to see it again. But basically, it really is at first both a diminution, a reductionism, and a hocket, and then it grows. It's still in 2, and then when it gets to the return, it becomes in 3. So the concentration between the 2 sections is in 2, and it is very reduced, and the return of the harmony and the things you know are in 3. But when the things that you know come back, the first violin now adds a layer of rhythmic complexity. The first violin, instead of they're doing this, ba-dee-dum and dee-ba-bum. So we have this dichotomy of ba-dee-bum and dee-ba-bum. But the first violin is going with notes that make that confusing. By what I mean by notes that make it confusing, if you have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But this sounds like 4. When you look on the page when you're playing it, you may not hear that, but when you're listening, you do. Okay, so let's hear the spot we just did from, maybe let's start right at bar 71, 72, 73, 74 and go on for a bit. Okay, very good. So that's clear what it is. It's an amazing addition and the return, an addition of not just ornamentation, but a rhythmic layer of complexity that is it's extraordinary. Now, I just want to play a couple of very brief things. This is the simplest example I can find in Brahms of complexity. Okay, now what's happening is there's a sense of 2 meters. It's really just written in 6/8. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4. And the tune, just like in this piece, the tune begins on the first beat is like it didn't happen. It's not there. So it sounds like a syncopation at first, but because the syncopation lasts so long, it establishes itself as a cross rhythm or even a cross meter. They're a cross determination. So I'll try that again. It's extraordinary. He does this all the time. Now, if you studied piano at all, or lived with someone who studied piano, or lived in the apartment below someone who studied piano, you probably know this piece. Not that piece. This piece that begins. Oh, well, I don't have the beginning, but the intermezzo that has this in it. It sounds very familiar. Perhaps you played it. Very often, because it's kind of easy to play, people don't appreciate who are playing it, the rhythmic complexity, because it's not the same kind of rhythmic complexity. It's phrasing complexity. I'll show you what I mean. It's in 3. There's the pickup. 3, 1, 3, 1, 2. But this is actually in 2. 1, starting right here. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And now the third beat sounds like it's 1 if you listen to the bass. And then 2, 1. So I'll play that from there again. It's a displaced 3. And in 2. So it's a rocking back and forth, but in this case, it is not syncopated. It is not in cross rhythms. It is not displaced with rests, but it is displaced by phrasing. So if you follow the phrasing, you hear all these other patterns, which actually makes it a little bit harder to play, but much more interesting. I have 2 more things to do before we hear this entire movement. One is, I don't usually play anything of mine, but I want to play a few phrases from something of mine because it is germane to this conversation. It's a piece called My Inner Brahms, and it is about Brahms's rhythmic piano writing. I'll just play you a few phrases. It's from a recording mostly of Brahms and some new pieces based on Brahms by Orly Shaham. Here's a little bit of it. Whoop, hold on. I want to go to a certain spot. I'll play about a minute of it. Okay, and then I want to do one more thing before we hear this piece, which is I've been making very horizontal remarks about the state of affairs in the world, and I decided to do something with Brahms about that. It's very simple. I took the accompaniment from this that you heard, D, ba-dum, exactly the way it is, except some minor changes, and I put a tune into it that you might recognize. See if it changed. You know, people talk about the importance of melody. So melody, Brahms was always telling everyone, write a good bass line and a good melody and then fill it in. And bass line is more important. It's all true, but the harmonic and rhythmic context in which a melody appears determines so much. So this is a familiar melody. I'll tell you what it is. It's My Country 'Tis of Thee, but in the Brahmsian world of this quartet. Just a comment. Okay, and now the entire slow movement.
Thank you.